let's get going tonight. I think a couple more people will trickle in. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get right to it tonight. We're going to do something a little different in the hopes of being efficient. And I'm going to share some thoughts on substitutions. And then I think we'll just stay as one group and we can kind of open it up to some discussions and get into some good stuff with that. I want to give just a rest in peace to ESPN Atlanta Falcons reporter Vaughn McClure. Super Dave, who's usually with us, was very close with him. So just wanted to make sure that we wish Vaughn's family well. I didn't know him personally, but he was obviously very good at his job and just like a brilliant man with everything that I've been reading today about him. So our condolences to the McClure family as they go through this, to Super Dave. I know he's struggling today. So just our thoughts and prayers are with you all. With regards to tonight, I need to give my dad, Paul, a special shout out for this topic of substitutions. A lot of my friends refer to Paul as Einstein, and he's the smartest person I know. He's an accomplished father, doctor, teacher, author, entrepreneur. He does it all. So this is kind of a homage to him. And both my parents watch a lot of film. I think that's where I get it from. So they will see this at a later date on the rerun. So love you both. And I love you, Dad. And thanks for the great idea. You know, he brings up a lot of questions, and he doesn't come from a basketball background, but with his background, he just always comes to me with questions. And one of the things he asks is, why not dig into a very specific part of the game and then try to master that, learn everything you can about that, become an expert on it, then in a way, you know, check that off your list and move on to the next topic. So that's the goal tonight, really dig into substitutions, try to investigate it, talk about it, learn everything we can about it, and then, you know, hopefully check that off our list in a way and move on. So basketball is such a random game. There's not much, you know, coaches love control, and they always think they're controlling everything, but you actually don't control that much. But playing time, your lineups, your substitution patterns is one of the few things that you can dictate. So control what you can control and go into each game with a plan. Don't just fly by the seat of your pants. Here are kind of the areas that I think about when talking about when we talk about substitutions. The first thing is lineups. So in the NBA, we get all this fancy data, but think about your 5-player lineups, and then think about your pairs, your trips, your quads, and those combinations of players. For example, what do these 3 players do on the court together? It might be a plus minus or a different grading technique. It might just be your eye on film. But different combinations of players together can have different impacts. So some teams, I think most of us probably do some sort of PPP, points per possession tracking when we, you know, run different plays and what's the outcome of it. But you can always take that a step further, especially if you have some manpower with certain lineups in the game. There are players in the game, whether it's these 2 running a side pick and roll or mid pick and roll, or these 4 people on the court together.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yep.
For you? So like we don't usually have access to that.
Yep.
There's companies starting to make affordable options of lineup data. I've gone back and forth between using it to help make decisions, and usually it kind of was like, okay, the data is interesting, let me watch the film and see why that's happening, not just here's the number, I'm going to use it. For us, like at the Division III level, we play 25 games.
Right.
So the sample size of the data is actually, I always wonder about like the statistically significant tipping point of like, when do you start to use that data to make decisions? Or are you strictly using it to say like, like these 4 guys in a group, their plus minus is good, let me watch on film and see what it is they're doing? Or is it just like, I need to play those 4 guys together more?
So I would say 2 things. One of the things I'm going to talk about a little later, but by the time you guys win your conference championship, the tournament, hopefully, you're going to play 3 or 4 of those teams 3 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think by the 3rd time you're playing a team in the playoffs, that's pretty relevant. That data, statistics, whatever you want to say. You have 2 full games of film to watch or rewatch. There might even be some similar opponents that you play like or that they play against that's like you in your conference. So I think that's another good place to look, whether it's a ball screen coverage or that you guys do or they do. And then I think about what Kevin Eastman talks about a lot. I think other coaches too, like what's the stat behind the stat? So like you said, if you can get a student manager or someone to track some of this stuff for you, some coaches want to watch the video and then look at that. I kind of like seeing what the numbers say before I watch the film and then seeing if those things match, which by the way, they don't always do. And you're the head coach, you make those decisions. So they're not always, and they should not always be the same, right? But I think it's like everything else. It's just part of the pie. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, Jonah.
Yeah.
Also, quick, and you might dive into this. My thing, what I've always wondered with lineup stuff is, and I don't think it does, but I could be wrong. How much does it take into account who the hell you're playing against? Because your 4 guys could look better or worse because of their 4 guys. And like, that's a factor, as you said, because the game is, so there's so much we can't control, but like, does it take that into account or?
So, well, we need Seth Partnow back on here to really answer this. So Pooh, get on back here. But I would say over the course of a season, even if you're playing 25 games, like Joe, how many games do you guys play?
30 before conference tournament.
Okay, so you could be in a good year, it could be 30, 32, 33, 35. Tommy, what I would say is your average, your mean is going to be the same across the league. Now, it's going to be a little worse against good teams and a little better against bad teams. So it's like if you are a good team, your starters are going to have a pretty good plus minus, right? And if you're a bad team, your starters are going to have a bad plus minus. So, Tommy, I would, and maybe an analytics person would disagree, but I would say I think all of that stuff kind of takes care of itself over the course of a season because it's going to come back to the average of what you guys do against those better and worse teams.
And that's kind of like what my point is, not to like have us end the call in 10 minutes because we don't need to use this stuff, but like at the end of the day, like the film can tell me that, right? Or is there information in here that I could not see by just watching the film alone? Like, for example, I can just think back to when I was at Johnson and, I could think about my 4-man. I could have put a 7-man lineup out there and it probably wouldn't have worked against, but maybe a few teams because we just weren't good enough. You know what I mean? Like that, like I didn't need that. And I think about teams also where I've been a part of where we've been obviously way closer to the top than to the bottom. But again, it's like, yeah, we kind of see it on film. Why? So I'm just curious. And I know, I'm assuming you will like link how the usage of that with film will help to like elevate everything.
Yeah. And I would just say to that, like, I think the realistic people that know the challenges that come with coaching aren't grading you at Johnson against what you're doing at Williams or those teams, right? Like even where we are as an organization in Sacramento, we're not ready to win a championship. So does that mean we'll keep our jobs?
That's not what you told me a couple of weeks ago when you went into the bubble, but we'll let that conversation remain private now.
No, but it's like, I think you have to use who you have, right? And in college, maybe you can impact that more with recruiting. In the NBA, it's probably more of a partnership with the front office. But like you have to use who you have. And if that's 2 good players and 4 average guys and everyone else sucks, that's what it is. But I think over the course of your coaching career, you're going to have different teams. So using all the things I talk about will help you in those situations. And we'll get into it more, but some of this stuff is like planning and some of it is in game as well. So I think those are they're part of the same conversation, but they're different aspects of it.
And Tommy, one of the things that we kind of saw over with us is that when we had guys that just weren't good enough to be consistent contributors, some of that plus minus information let us figure out what guys we could plug in for minutes with our guys that could play to kind of gap the minutes in between when people needed rest. So that's one of the ways that we utilize some of that plus minus information in the division level when you don't necessarily have all the talent that you need to be successful all the time or have your best players on the court all the time.
And Jaren,
You mean I can't? Hey, you mean I can't play these games with turn fatigue off and I have unlimited fouls? That's what I need.
Tommy, I've started to see some plus minus stuff that's adjusted based on who they're on the court against.
Yeah.
But it's not, I haven't seen it like large scale, but I have seen some articles and stuff where people are starting to look at like, okay, this 5-player lineup has this offensive efficiency. So like, how did this 5-player lineup do defensively against them? And so I think I've started to see some stuff, to your point, that would kind of account for like, okay, are they playing Williams starting 5 or are they playing the JV squad back up in the old gym?
There's a big difference. Yeah. Thanks, Hoppy.
So the next thing I'll talk about is just different coverages. And a lot of second units in the NBA, they switch 1 through 5, or you'll see, Plumlee in Denver will blitz a lot, that second unit. So just thinking about different coverages to maximize the players that you have playing with different lineups. And offensively, teams might have a lineup to play versus switches. They might have a lineup to red 1 through 5, defensively. So I would have all these different types of lineups in the game. So Jaren, to your point, it might be a guy who isn't offensively gifted like myself, right? But a good defender. So that might be when you press, Clay Moser, who's often with us, one of his big things is always press a backup point guard because they normally aren't great at handling pressure. So maybe you just have a ball hawk who can't do much, but can buy you 2 or 3 minutes, kind of in the middle of the first half, just to spark the game up a little bit, and you buy your stud 2 or 3 minutes. And then
how do you guys at the pro level, because I'm sure you do that, but you don't practice as much as maybe you would want to have that happen? How do you build continuity in those lineups? Do you just like say in the second quarter with 6 minutes left, we're going to just put this lineup in to see? Or is there more intentionality behind it?
I would say practice it. And I have written here, like, think about a wildcat formation in football, right? So how the New Orleans Saints use Taysom Hill, and you got Drew Brees, who maybe isn't playing well this year, but a Hall of Fame quarterback. And then Hill comes in every now and then. It's just a completely different look. And Zach and I talk about this a ton. Like, you could have a few basic looks, but if you put different people in it, it just changes how you have to worry about it. So, Tommy, I would say to your question, we know we don't have a lot of practice, but if it's a 1 through 5 Reading defensive unit, we'll practice that for a segment of practice, right? And a lot of practice in the NBA is in the games, but most teams have a consistent substitution pattern throughout a season where they get that second unit that's blitzing, say, the last 3 minutes of the first quarter and the first 2.5 to 4 minutes of the second quarter. So there's 5 to 7 minutes, whatever it is, every night that they're practicing that specific coverage or offensive set or action.
That makes sense. Because I was going to say, because college and down, we have actual practice time. With the amount of games you play, I mean, I wouldn't think it was a walkthrough thing, but you just have to designate time in the game just to do it. Makes sense.
And it might not be live. It might be a walkthrough, right? Or it might be in a ballroom, but just talking about it. And then, of course, like everything we do, it's showing it on video. So using those game reps, dissecting it, talking about what worked well, what didn't work well. Then the last thing with coverages and just lineups is the classic end of game. So you saw this with Miami. They would put in Solomon Hill. And an end of game doesn't necessarily have to be end of game. It might be last possession of a quarter. It might be last possession of a half. It might be a short clock situation defensively that you put, they call timeout with 2 seconds left on the shot clock, and you put your 7-footer that can't play in front of the ball or right by the rim. So there's a lot of different ways to use that. That's not just the last minute or two of a game. I think the next big thing is matchups and who's guarding who. And this is what I was talking about, Hop. Like playoffs, it gets magnified, but especially for the college teams, by the second time you play your team in conference and the third time in the conference tournament, like if your program is at the point where you're winning games in your playoff tournament, I think this is where all this stuff becomes more useful. And your prep time might not be like, the reason you have your processes with this is your conference tournament, you might play back-to-back days, or it might be game, maybe off if you're lucky, or you get a bye, whatever it is, and then game. So you're not going to have a ton of time. But if you have all that stuff the night after you played the team the first time, the second time, now no matter which we're playing, we win, and we're playing the winner of, team A versus team B. We have both those things kind of in our hands already thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And it might not be, I was going to talk about this later, but like, I don't think this information should be the only thing that dictates it. And this is where like I would maybe disagree with my dad, who's more probably scientifically backed in his decision making. I think it's part of it, but you have to feel it out, and you just really have to know your team and know your guys. Like 2-3 games isn't like an 82 game season. So I think you, as a coach of your team, your players the best. So I think you also have to rely on your instincts and the feeling you get around your players, which is also part of the pie.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about matchups, like when you think back to the finals, the last week or two, the Lakers' length was obviously smothering defensively. But the middle few games when Kelly Olynyk was playing and shooting a lot, regardless if he was making or missing in a weird way, it just opened the court up for them so offensively. So obviously I know Coach Spoelstra had his reasons for playing the guys he played when he played them, so I'm not critiquing him there. But Brian Shaw, who's with us in LA, he always used to say they have to guard us too, right? So maybe Kelly Olynyk isn't a great guard on Anthony Davis, but he's getting Anthony Davis out of the lane defensively and opening up those driving lanes for Jimmy Butler and guys like that.
The Clippers didn't win?
No comment. We'll
We could edit that out?
Yep.
Okay.
And I know most of your programs don't have the resources we do with NBA, and Second Spectrum is great. Our analytics department does a great job giving us the resources to prepare for every game, and especially from a scouting perspective. So part of our scouting report they provide us is the opponent's substitution patterns, which help us prepare for when we're going to sub, especially if it's for a matchup. So I'll show you guys what they give us, and it's the last 2 games, like minute by minute, and then as a heat chart the last 5 games, just because subbing trends change over time due to injuries, trades, how certain players are playing. I think all of that stuff accounts to when a coach will play their guys. So we'll get this. So this was the 2 games. This was 2 game out. This was 1 game out of Denver. This is from a game in, right around the new year. And again, by position right here, this was the 2nd game out. And then this is like their heat chart from the 5 games before they played us. So it's a pretty good visual. So Gary Harris, and there's 12 of these little boxes right here. So all 5 games, Gary Harris played the first 7 minutes, right? And most of that 8th minute. And for the most part, he always came in and played almost the last 5 minutes. And that's normal for most starters, I would say, across the NBA. And so like for Patrick and Zach in these programs that have more manpower, I mean, you can have a manager track this stuff, or there's ways to do it I'd be interested to see if you guys have your managers code this type of stuff with subbing patterns, but there's a lot of different ways to do that. You guys can both speak up if you want, or you don't have to.
I think we've actually been talking about adding that into our code windows for our managers, is to get that heat chart in there, or that heat map in there for sub patterns. And for us, like we like to, we have kind of our second unit plays and things like that. And so that information becomes useful, knowing when we're going to go to those and that kind of thing.
Kind of same thing with us. We'll probably add like player minutes to our code window just to get guys, trends of when they're playing, when they're more successful, what, kind of end of half situation, stuff like that. I think it's very helpful. I've never seen the little heat chart that you showed. I thought that was pretty interesting. I have to take a little bit more of a look at that. I think that's good to see, like over the past like 5 games, you can see like when is Gary Harris subbing out, when is Jokic getting his break. I think that's important because, you kind of look at the team's best players in college, like usually they're coming out right before the media. And I think too, it's like the mid-major level, you see a lot of teams playing small. So like it's when, like, are they playing 5 small? Are they playing, when did they sub their big out? Did he have 2 fouls? Like that kind of, check box is going through my head right now with that. But I love that chart. That's great stuff.
Right. And maybe in the college game, it's the last 3. I don't know what the number is. Last 3 or 4 games. Maybe 5 is too big of a sample size. But another thing to consider there.
I feel like with college, you're really monitoring, who's their 5 and who's running the point guard. Because I feel like those two, everything else in there, maybe if there's like a wing in there that's kind of dynamic, whether it's a guy that's not a shooter or like just as, a pick and pop 5 or whatever, or a pick and pop 4 and their ball screen coverage kind of switches up like a team, whether they're switching 1 through 3. I don't know. It's just something to keep an eye on. Sorry.
Right. No, it's great.
So for this, I guess my question would be like, okay, we have the data. Like, how do we apply it? Are we going to switch our rotations, or are we going to stick to what we do and make them adjust to us type of mentality, right? Like, okay, Tommy's the other team's best player. I know they're going to sub, or he's the best defender. I know they're going to sub him out at 6 minutes. Does that mean I wait to put my best player in so that he's then playing against their second best defender and mess with my team's rotation? Or do I just be like, you know what I'm saying here?
Absolutely. I would say information is power, right? And I don't think you can say one thing. I was going to talk about this later too with your bench, but as a coach, you're trying to put your team in the best position to win games. Really, hopefully win a championship, if we're being honest, right? So are you coaching to win the game, or are you coaching to win the championship or the season, however you want to phrase that, or next year, right? Like our I'm not going to use that example, but would an NBA franchise play a young player who maybe isn't ready to play or start or play 35 minutes, but needs to get that experience to get to that level? And I think that's up to you to decide. But I think it's understanding the difference between playing to win the game versus like later date. And then also it's like, how do you, like, you got to play the game, right? And you're going to scout and know what they do. They're going to scout and know what you do, but it doesn't mean you don't do it. So I would say it's tweaks here and there, and then maybe an occasional doing something completely different. But there was a great, I forget what the kind of like NBA roundtable with head coaches at Summer League a couple of years ago. And I think Jaeger was actually the one saying it, like, you can't just run trick plays the whole season. Like, your guys see through that. It's ironic because he's got a lot of good tricky plays. But if you keep changing things, you're going to lose your team, right? So I think in the greater context, it's maybe trying to steal a minute here or there, but it's hard to do something different every day.
Unless that's your identity.
Absolutely. Which, by the way, can be great. It's really hard to scout against. And
Like, didn't the Raptors switch things a ton? And
yeah, they had a
I
top.
read an article where he was like, it's less about us running the defense well and more just about making the other team uncomfortable because they haven't seen it or played against it.
And I would say that with those defenders they have on that team, anything you do is going to be pretty good. Length, versatility, strength, smarts, communication, right? Like, you could coach that team very well, and that's not a knock on you.
It's like coaching Williams.
Exactly. If only they had a good assistant coach, right? But
I'll tell Coach App you said that.
Jonah, how much of I see teams like the Jazz running a ton of stuff, and I know a lot of NBA teams have, lengthy, playbooks and stuff. I'm just interested. Do you guys try to strategize, like, I guess you have packages for, De'Aaron Fox or guys getting post-ups and stuff like that. You try to get those in those time segments where you feel like the matchup's going to be there? Do you, like, mark that down based on that data? How does that kind of go in?
I would say you have to come to the session on offensive game planning.
All right. I'll be there.
No.
What a sell.
Make a good donation, and I'll tell you. No. I think that's some of it, but we think of – and Igor was really good about thinking the game in different segments. So, transition, early thrust, secondary. You had your half-court set plays, then your crunch time package, and a couple others that we can dive into in a different session. But I would say crunch time, again, like I was talking about earlier, doesn't just have to be last 4 or 5 minutes of the game. But most teams in the NBA run a mid-pick and roll to get a switch or to attack the weakest defender, which we saw all playoffs long.
Duncan Robinson, yep.
Exactly.
Shout out Williams.
I love that.
So that, and then, like, Steve Clifford is notorious. Like, he's every starter fourth quarter, almost every time he's going to run a backdoor cut for one of his athletic wing guys. And Miami Heat with Goran Dragic, they would always run a backdoor, kind of like a through action to a back screen, but then Dragic would actually back cut after he set the back screen. That would usually be like the under 6 timeout. So I think different coaches approach that different ways. We might not talk about it like certain times of the game based on their substitution patterns, but it would be more picking out their defenders that we want to attack.
Yep. That's great.
I just think, like, the biggest thing for all of this is because it's such a random game, I think it's great to go into a game with a plan. So I'm going to show you guys a template that one of our coaches, Will Scott, created a couple years back. And you can tweak it easily. So, for the women college coaches who will watch this, you can make this 4 10-minute quarters. For the college coaches, you can make it 2 20-minute halves. But you'll get the concept of it. And then I would suggest your head coach and your full staff or the top assistants fill it out before the game. And then during the game, if the head coach wants to have it, in their coat or on the scores table, great. Or one of the assistants can have it and just remind you throughout the game when to make the subs. So very easy. And you can make this in Excel. You can make it a lot of different ways, but we'll just put the point guard's initials right there, down through the center. And then when you want to sub, we put, say it's at 8:30, we put another, the back Corey Joseph, CJ right there. And we'll talk about how you can change this, but I always like this just visually. You can kind of almost like that Heat chart, but it's a little different. You can see the game played out. Mostly for most teams, I think your first half will be pretty similar to your second half. And then by the time you get to here, you're just reading the game. But I really like that just from a visual point of view.
So, Jonah, just to get some perspective on that, like, how often do you guys go into that and, like, by halftime, you decide that you need to completely change up your rotations that you have in the second half?
Not very. I would say it comes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, if you're always – now, there's a few things I'll talk about one in a little bit. If this is what you do every game, then so be it. Or if your strategy is just to play 11 deep and I'm going with the players I like that night, great. But for our team's last few years, we've had a pretty steady diet of our subs. And I think most teams in the NBA do. Because if I'm always taking out my starter going into the second half, what's that doing to his confidence? Right? So, again, you have to find different ways to motivate your team throughout a long, treacherous NBA season that gets pretty difficult in the dog days. You know, normal season January is tough, and that's where Zach and I always joke, but Corey Brewer can win you 3 or 4 games because he's the only guy out there playing hard in the whole month of January, right? So, and that's not a knock on him either. Like, that's his skill, and that's why he's had a great NBA career. But to me, if you're constantly changing it, you're going to lose your players.
That makes a lot of sense.
Plus, Jonah, I think that at the pro level, you could tell me if I'm wrong, your teams are probably built out in the form of the rotation. You know what I mean? Like you're looking at it as 9, however many guys you're going to play. Whereas like when I think about that question and just some things with like substitutions, like, and especially when you said game planning, I'm going into a game, having watched that team, and I'm thinking about my roster and maybe where I can sprinkle something in or take advantage of a kid's skill set that can be kryptonite to that other team, you know, whereas like in the pros, like it is what it is, way more so than it is in college probably.
Yeah, maybe. I think I would agree with that.
How much do you think, out of curiosity, like skill level consistency plays into it? Like I imagine NBA players are more consistent in their outcome, their production, etc., than Division III guys that I've seen. So like for me as a head coach, I've tried doing that and having a plan going into the game.
Yep.
And most times when we play the game, I end up deviating off of it. I think it's useful to like have a baseline. Again, it's like there's good information on the front end, and then I end up adjusting based off of the feel of the team, etc. But part of me wonders like how much of that is just due to the variability of skill performance, especially at our level where they have to go to class, they're dealing with family issues, they're like, it's not just their job to perform at basketball. So sometimes
I thought it was. I thought Hickson said it was at Amherst.
No,
that's what Coach Hickson said.
No, that was only Mike Maker, and Kevin App.
But that's I think about the game of basketball very, and maybe it's because I've done so much video and scouting in my background, but like I try, and this is what I started with tonight. Like I tried to think about how the game is going to be played before it's played, right? And of course, it's like everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Like I know that, but I would say like take away subbing and take a step back. Every time I have a scout, my dad asks me how did it go, and I'm the first couple times I was like it was great, we won by 12, and then it was like it was terrible, we lost by 4. He's like I don't care about that. Like from what you said was going to happen, did that happen? Offensively, defensively, personnel. So my question to you would be like, from that perspective, I would guess you're normally pretty close to what you think is going to happen, right?
Yeah. So I mean, to me, it's like process. You're talking straight up process, not results. Of like, what are you focusing on? Was the scout good because we won or lost, or was it good because what we were trying to accomplish, we accomplished on the court?
Right.
Which I think is the quote unquote the art of coaching. Like, I could go up to Williams and play Tommy's team and go in with a game plan. Here's how we want to guard ball screens. Here's how we want to guard this. Here's how we want to guard that. And we can do it, and they can just make enough shots and beat us, or we can not do something on the offensive end and win. And the question could be like, okay, did you have a good scout? Yeah, the scout was good. Like,
right.
We put it in place. We did what we wanted. They just made shots.
But that's my question. Like, when you have scripted the minutes, just say,
yeah,
what it's just, let's say your top 2 players are normally pretty solid, but players 3 through 9, it's just kind of sporadic. Is that, like, I'm asking, like, is that the
I think
inconsistency?
I think it depends on the. Usually, you have like 2 or 3 guys that you can count on.
Right.
Pretty much every night they're going to play well, and then after that, sometimes it's a little.
My question would be, like, if you can play the game before it's played in your head from a strategic point of view and personnel point of view, whether you win or not, or they're way more or less talented than you, then why can't you play that game in your head based on the minutes? You know what I mean?
No. I'm saying like I do that and think about it. It's when it goes into action. I'm just curious if you think that the variability of skill level and consistency plays a role in how often I would deviate from the plan versus how often you're going to deviate from the plan. Like, you have NBA players, so you can be like, listen, I'm leaving this dude on the court for 6 minutes and then he's coming off, and I'm putting this dude on the court and he's a professional and he's going to perform at X level. For me, at the Division III level, it's a little bit more inconsistent of like, I can say, okay, Tommy's our best player. I know he needs 4 minutes of rest. I'm going to put Jonah in at 6 minutes and give Tommy like whatever amount of time rest. And maybe Jonah had a final exam that day. His girlfriend broke up with him, and his parents called him, and he is a disaster.
Right.
I'm just curious, like, skill level wise, do you think that at the higher skill levels, there's guys that are probably more consistent, or do you think that's just always feel?
I would say outside of the bubble, NBA players have more distractions than Division III players. Like, way more.
Yeah.
It's from what comes with being an NBA player and everyone wanting something and money and
social media.
So, yeah, I would say it was really interesting because in the bubble, I think a lot of those distractions were eliminated. I think that's why you saw some players elevate their games. But I would not agree with that general sentiment.
Gotcha.
And I might be wrong. That's just my point of view, because I think NBA players are same thing. I mean, all those reasons, except it wasn't an exam, it was something else, right? And I think NBA players are pulled in a lot of different directions, and it's very difficult. Everyone always wanting something from you.
Well, I'll say this though. I think Hoppy's onto something, but I think you're saying something too. I think maybe the point is where the NBA player just knows how to lock in, period, when it's time to play, where like that other stuff could affect, and or just as Hoppy's saying, because I think and it could be like, obviously as you trickle down, players aren't as consistent. They just can't, we don't know, like consistent at Division III is just consistent. It's different than consistent at the pro level, you know? But as we've been having this discussion, because I've never done the substitutions, like I'm going to put it, I have an idea, but like I always feel like the game starts to go and you start to feel what's happening and you know your team and what you need. And like, where does that play? And it's different in the NBA, I get it. That's kind of like my thing of where I've lived with it, you know?
Let me, because next I'm going to talk about like why we deviate from that.
Mm-hmm.
So let me get through this list and then we can open it up again, and maybe you guys will agree or disagree. It doesn't matter. And we can kind of use that as a jumping off point. But just like the cautions or reasons why you might adjust, obviously foul trouble is number one. And we can get into more detail with this one later. But I would just say, like the Van Gundy's talk about this all the time, just because a player picks up the second foul in the second quarter, say, like, you don't necessarily have to take them out. What's the difference in them picking up that third foul with 2 minutes left in the second quarter or 11 minutes left in the third quarter? And I think playing with fouls is an art and a skill that especially good players that foul a lot learn how to do. The next thing would be matchups. We've talked about that. Obviously injuries, which are somewhat of an uncontrollable, and even returning from an injury where there's oftentimes a minute restriction. I think a big one is conditioning. And sometimes this is when a player returns from injury and they're on like a minutes restriction. But also it could just be a player is better when they're fresh. So in LA, we had a center who started a lot of games and was extremely effective, efficient, productive the first 4 minutes he was in the game. And then as soon as that 5th minute hit, he just went and just became very unproductive, we will say. So once we recognized that, we would just go for the 4-minute spurts, first to start, kind of end of the first, beginning of the second, maybe to end the half, depending on how the game is going. So that's another thing to think about. And then obviously how a player is performing, if it's good or bad, if they're gaining a rhythm, if they're making shots, if they're defending well, and obviously the positives and negatives of all of those. And I would say just because it's a positive, it does not mean stay in. So one coach I know, when a struggling player makes a shot, they will take that player out shortly after that, so that when the player goes back in, they're feeling good about themselves. So I don't think it's always positive stay in, negative stay out. And then I just think we've talked about this a little bit, but using the bench as a motivator. So subbing to prove a point to that player or maybe to a different player. I think that the bench can obviously be a coach's best friend and can pay dividends.
Hey, Jonah.
Yes.
To back up to the one with fouls, how much, how much is given to the fact of, or are you tracking or know this with regards to who's officiating a game and how they might call a game and or how they react to a guy who has a couple fouls early, all of that? I mean, you got so many damn people. I hope that someone's tracked. Like, where does that land?
Yeah.
In that process?
I don't want to get fined.
Maybe you can't give that away. Yeah,
I don't want to get fined.
Okay, that's all I need to know.
No.
Yeah, no,
But
I just wondered if it was considered.
I would say that we talked about which referees have which games. Yes.
Because
keep it moving.
Well, you know what's funny though is like and as you start to trickle down. First of all, I will not get fined, so I can say this: we have shitty refs at all levels, NBA down. They can try to fine me if they want to, but it does get worse progressively as you go down, and that's something like I don't want to say buying into this, but like you do have to factor that in. Even maybe more so because you just don't know. And I mean, if you know, there's some dudes that we know, like, yeah, forget about it. But so I'm glad that you said that. I just wondered how much that played into it.
But again, like you have to play the game and you're thinking about it. There might be a technical or there might be some not nice words back and forth, but like, I think for the most part, you're not going to deviate too much. That's just another part of the puzzle, right? It's another part of the pie that you factor in. It's funny though, because like one rep in particular likes the road team more, historically, we'll just say. So that like when you have them on the road and a tough place to play, like it's a Utah on a back-to-back, you got in late and you see he has your game, like you always feel a little better going into that one.
Well, tell them you said so.
Okay, please do. They can't find me for that. They should pay me.
No, they can't.
That, right?
That's correct.
I would say, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just talking about subbing a great player or players, a couple things here. If you have two really good players, I would always just try to have one on the court at all times. If you have three great players, try to keep two on the court at all times. And that's a pretty basic concept, but I think it goes a long ways. And then have your packages when they're both on the court and then when each one is on the court. And if neither are on the court, it means you're winning by a lot or losing a lot, so it doesn't really matter.
And if you have four great players, don't schedule me. Play somebody else. How about that one?
Right.
Add that in there somewhere.
Jonah, can you talk a little bit about I've heard a lot this offseason on playing less guys and giving them more confidence. I think it's kind of like a D'Antoni deal. Like playing 7 or 8 guys, they know they're going to play. They know what their minute, they know where their shots are coming from. And it's a different type of confidence instead of having a guy or a spot that has 3 or 4 guys, depending on who hits their first shot or makes a defensive play, like whatever it is.
Yep.
I think there's something to be said. I just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the bench next. So
Nice.
let's table that. And then if I don't answer your questions or you have
Yeah, no worries. Perfect.
Raptors did that a lot too, Pat. They
Yeah.
did that a lot. They played their starters a lot of minutes.
Yeah.
They should.
Was someone else going to say something?
I was gonna say, I think going back to like what you sub guys for is also another feel thing of like, depending on the player. Sometimes you're like, this kid doesn't think he ever screws up. So when he does make a mistake, I'm gonna sub him out and coach him on it and put him back in. And then the other kids are like, they're a head case. They beat themselves up. So you're going to kind of like maybe leave them a little longer just to try to get them to do something positive and then take him out and reinforce that with him.
Or you take him out and he does something great and you just like catch him doing something right and you applaud the heck out of him and you give him a bunch of love and you sit him down before he messes up again or messes up. And then, hey, you got 3 minutes out. I'm coming right back to you. And the head case came out. He's feeling great about himself. You feel great about him. He maybe cools off a little bit and catches his breath and then goes right back in. So I definitely agree with that.
Do you try to do that in the pros? Like, would you try to like not sub someone off a bad play, or like it's just that's not a part of the equation?
I think that's like the Phil Jackson model, right? Like play through mistakes, which I think he obviously influenced Luke a ton in his philosophy.
Because I think we're learning more and more. Like we look at like professional athletes as like these superheroes, but we're learning more and more each day about how their mind plays games with them. Here are people at the highest level who, they need our love and support as well and building their confidence too. So I just wondered how much. I think it's probably creeping in more and more at your level.
And like, it's the same thing with taking timeouts, right? Like you can take them, but then you run out of them. Like one of those finals games, they went into the fourth quarter.
One timeout.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, again, it might change throughout, but I think for the most part, we try to let our guys play through some mistakes. And at a certain point, it reminds me of a similar question, but like, when do you adjust, right? So a lot of coaches have said this, like, we're going to talk about it. We're going to get them to do it harder. Then we're going to get someone else in there. Then if they can't do it, we're going to get them to do it harder. And then if those 3 things don't work, maybe we'll talk about an adjustment. But before we do those things, we're not like they beat us on it once in the first quarter and the players turning around like, I knew we should have switched it or we should have whatever it. It's like, no, do it right, and then we'll talk about it. Like, I don't think very often a scheme beats you. I think it's what you're doing with that scheme.
That's another thing, though, too, with the length of your game and the length of our game. Like, you could have 3 possessions. Like, we might have to get off that quicker because before you know it, you're down 15 and there's just less time. You're being down 15 is different than us being down 15 in college or lower,
Right.
Where do you fall on the idea of, like, just getting players to buy into the scheme? Like, I mean, for us, so far in coaching, we've probably had lower IQ guys just from the standpoint of they've seen less basketball. Like they've actually had less reps, like playing different coverages, playing against different coverages. Like NBA guys, one NBA season is like 3 years of college basketball for us. So like they play 3 years in the NBA and they've seen every coverage. We don't adjust it as much. Like how much of it goes back to, I've talked to some people that are like, just get the players to do what they're comfortable with and believe in is the best approach, because if they think it's going to work, they're going to play harder than if it's just, oh, coach told me to do this coverage and then he told me to do it harder and then he took me out and then he told another guy to do it that didn't want to do it and then he told that guy to do it harder and then finally we switched versus just like, you know what? Tommy's a big guy. I'm asking him to hard hedge. He's better on a flat show. Either way, our guard's chasing over the top or like whatever the scenario ends up being. But if those guys think that's going to work, like where do you fall on that balance?
one of our defensive coordinator, actually Bob Byer, he always says cluttered minds equals slow feet.
Yeah.
So, and that goes to your point. So I think about that a lot. The more I've seen and the more I watch, the more I realize it's really not about a scheme. It's like putting your players in a position to succeed. But we talked about this with, let's just take an Eastern Conference team that's kind of on Lake Michigan, for example. And Zach can maybe chime in here, but they did one scheme as a team and they were at the level. And it worked for some of their bigs, and maybe it wasn't the right coverage for some of their other bigs, but that was what they did. And it eliminated all decisions. This is who we are. This is what we do. And I respect that and I understand it. And I think the players that I've talked to on that team also understood that, even if they know it's not putting them maybe personally in their best position to succeed. So I think there's different philosophies. I would look across your league and see, what actions are going to give you the biggest issues. So, I don't know your conference at all and what teams are doing, if it's Princeton stuff or pick and roll stuff, whatever. But like, what has given you guys the biggest issues or gives you pause in each game plan? And then where have you guys had success guarding those things? And that's probably how I would try to build out my defense, kind of reverse engineer it.
Makes sense.
So back to the great player, like if you just have one or even a couple, like when do you take them out? And most teams do this, but always try to sub them out before an official timeout or a quarter break is coming to get them more real-time rest. And yet they're still missing less game time, off the court. And if you're going to call a timeout, like sometimes it's funny, you sub a star player out, they want to stay in, and then 30 seconds later, you're going to call a timeout. So you can always, like, as they're coming off, you can tell them, hey, like, I'm about to burn one, just chill, I got you. And then they can sit down, and they're getting that extra 30 seconds. Maybe it's a free throw, so it's more time. And, I mean, national TV games, those timeouts are pretty long. So I know you guys get a lot of those up at Williams, but and
we
then
spill water on the court. That's what we do.
Jason Kidd style, huh? And then even if you take like your stud out or shooter out with a minute and a half left in the quarter, if there's a stoppage in a play or out of bounds, before that last possession, you can always put them back in. And that to maybe handle the ball or ISO, whatever it is at that last possession of the quarter. But that leads me to the next point, Patrick, about the bench. Yep. And it's a few things to cover here. Some we've talked about already, but are you subbing for the game or the season? So what is, like, I think a few of us have talked about this idea of, like, what are we doing for the player psyche, right? And I think, Tommy, like you said, the more players are speaking up and finding a voice with everything, whether it's mental illness or pressures they're dealing with, all of these things that are very real, I think we as coaches need to understand that. So if you're always taking the bench player out at the end of the first quarter during his 4 minutes where he normally does play to put the star back in, what's that doing for that player? And I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong. It might be different for different games. It might be depending on how both of those players are playing, but it's just something to consider. And I think most championship teams depend on their depth at some point of their championship run, right? And it might not be that final game. It might be the Sweet 16 or it might be the Eastern Conference Finals, whatever it is. But how are you enhancing this during your season to get those bench players, to that level? I remember when Doc Rivers was with the Celtics, Nate Robinson had like an unbelievable playoff game. And in the interview after the game, he said, I kept telling him he's going to win us a playoff game. And he just knew it. And he let him shoot his shots, right? He had confidence in him. And that was his message to Nate Robinson throughout that season. So
I just think that happens and doesn't actually come to fruition with coaches.
Like, hey, you're going to win us a playoff game, and then they shoot you out of the game.
Win us a playoff game, and then we don't win any playoff games.
Did you lose because that player shot? or play 10 minutes. Like,
No, I was just curious because we always hear the story after the fact. And I feel
Right.
like as a coach, I'm usually focused on trying to build confidence in players, whether or not I think it's actually going to come to fruition. And if it doesn't, I just never bring it up again. And if it does, I'm like, yeah, Tommy, I told you you were going to make
Yeah.
you made the shot. Of course you're making the shot. You're going to make it next time too.
right. Joe, what you got?
I'm wondering if you guys, you talk about resting a player in the NAI, D3, D2. We don't have media timeouts. So the first half really goes by a lot faster than the second half because most coaches save their timeouts for the second half. I mean, it's like 25, 28 minutes in real time, and then we're heading down to the locker room for halftime. How long do you if you're going to, in a 40-minute college game, your top player plays 28 to 32 minutes per game, how long do you take him out? How long is too long? Let's get him out versus let's get him out for a blow here and there for a couple of minutes, okay, and then let's get him right back in. I'm wondering if there's a sort of a threshold where holding him out is too long. All right, I need, like Jonah, you keep bringing up, we're coaching for the season, so I'd love to play my guy 38 minutes tonight, but I can't. I want to keep him at 30, 32. So how long is too long? And what is there any data or science in what constitutes an optimal rest period in a college game or an NBA game?
I'm not sure. That's a great question. What pops in my head is, and I'm sure some college coaches do this, but like, when does your star player get fatigued in the first half? Or he doesn't and you're just saving him for the second half? No, like when do you normally take the guy out?
Between 16 and 14 minutes usually.
Okay, so
like a 4 to 6 minute burst, and then he's coming out.
So I would consider and how many timeouts do you get for the game?
We get 6, and I try to only use 1 in the first half unless we're getting our ass kicked. We'll use 2, and then you got 4 in the second half.
Right. So I would say at 14:30 to 15:30, somewhere in there, what would happen if you burn your timeout? That's your stud's first rest. And then at like 12-ish, you took him out. So now he's played 8 minutes, but he's gotten a pretty good blow.
Okay.
You know, a 2-minute, whatever your timeouts are, 2:15, 2:30, whatever it is. And
A minute 30.
I was going to say, we wish.
75 seconds, Jonah.
Yep.
So by the time you get in the huddle, the horn's going off.
Yeah, they're
It's
quick,
either
man.
Take a 30
yeah.
or you get a full minute or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, never
And
mind.
they're rushing you out.
Yep.
So
That's when you pour the water on the court.
Hey, if you pour Pepsi, you can get an extra 2 minutes. It stains the court.
Hey, you know what? I do have a trick, guys, and the referees hate it. They'll ask me, I'll say timeout, and I won't signal 30 or full. And they'll ask me for like 20 seconds, Coach, is it a 30 or full? I'll pretend like I didn't hear them, and it buys us like an extra 10 seconds. And then finally I'll say, oh, yeah, it's just a 30 or just a full.
30, but
You might want to try that
actually
one.
a full. Thanks. I like
that's
that.
pretty good.
I do think I do think the like dead ball, take your best player out, and like 2 possessions late, next dead ball, call like bang a full timeout.
So
buys some time.
But Joe, like maybe you sub him out at 15 for a possession or 2, and then you call that timeout at 13:30, and then he's going back in until 10. So he's missed a minute and a half of game time, but he's gotten some, especially if it's like a free throw and that dead ball is even longer.
Hey, how would you do that for the women's coaches? How would you do that for their quarters? Because their quarters are different than your quarters in the sense that it's still a continuation of, maybe I'm wrong. I view it, the NBA is like, it's almost like the start of a new thing where it's like, you know, so how would you do that for the women, basically?
Besides the 10 to 12 minutes, how is it?
Yeah, like when would you do it? Because, you know, maybe we want to keep our best player out there. To, you know, a couple late possessions in the quarter. We want to finish strong. How would you like stagger that time for them?
I'm not understanding why you approach it differently. is my
The
question.
breaks are shorter between where your quarters would be for the women's game in college than it is for the men's. It's like essentially a full timeout. And
Yeah, but so they get the extra timeout in between quarters. Like there's a natural chance for your best player to recover.
Right. So I would use that like we just talked about with Joe. So I would probably take them out a little earlier, and then like 10-minute quarter, I would play them the first 5 minutes, say, and then take them out and then put them back in at, say, 2:30. So they've missed 2.5 minutes of game time. Then after a 2-minute sprint to the end of the quarter, they're going to go back in. Or you do that's how I think I would do it. Or you do it the other way. You have them play like 7 minutes or 7.5 minutes, and then you take them out at, say, 2:30 or 3, and then you don't put them back in until like 6 or 7 in the second, so they get that full. Or you burn a timeout towards the end of the first or at the beginning of the second as well.
Let me ask you this.
But just
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, just to respond to Joe, like, we shouldn't go too far that way, right? Like, if you called a timeout with 2 minutes left, you sub them out at 2:30, so they got a little time before that, and then they're out for that timeout, then the 2 minutes of game time, then the quarter break, then 2 more minutes of the second quarter. Is that too long of a blow? And I would say that depends on the player. Like, I think every player is different.
I was going to say that's the other part is the player, like what's their conditioning like?
Right.
We could say like, okay, I want to play my starting point guard 4 minutes. I want to play my small forward 6. I want to play my power forward 2. But like at the end of the day, it's like, what's their conditioning level? What's their effort level? Like what can they maintain? What's going to contribute to winning? And we need to adjust to that. So like my point guard is going to be different from Tommy's point guard, is going to be different from Zach's, from Patrick, like whoever. And so much of it is just like, I guess raising your awareness of your players and when they take the dip in performance,
right,
and being able to preempt that and sub them out before it's coming, and not just wait around and be like, okay, that guy turned the ball over twice and we just gave up 4 points in transition, so I'm going to take him out. It's like, no, I know he's about to do that, so I subbed him beforehand.
I would say, and going back to the bench, a couple other points I wanted to make or are you telling, someone said this earlier, but like, are you telling your bench players when they're going in? And like for me personally in college, I did not play at all my first year. I played like 4 minutes. And my second year, started the second season, I didn't play at all. And then we're on the way to a road game at St. John's, and the assistant coach came up to me on the bus and told me I was going in the 14-minute. I was coming out at the 10-minute mark. And it just gave me a lot of confidence knowing that, like, no matter what happened in those 4 minutes, I was going to be in there. And I went into the game with that confidence. And, again, I thought maybe if I played well enough, they would repeat it in the second half. So, but I was just focused on those 4 minutes. Like, I knew from practice that I could go hard for 4 minutes. I did. I think I ended up playing like 2 minutes in the second half. But as a bench player that didn't play that much, that gave me a ton of confidence. I would also say, if you happen to ever go to a San Antonio Spurs game, watch what Patty Mills does. And Manu Ginobili used to do this back in the day, but they both normally go in right under that 6-minute media timeout. So they'll use that timeout to warm up on the court and start on the baseline. They sprint out to the foul line, elbow extended and shuffle over and backpedal. They do some, stop and go stuff, acceleration, decelerations. So like if there's different ways you can help get your bench players engaged. Rondo he's like known for during timeouts going up to the ball and massaging it, and the refs get mad. But it could be different for different players, but giving them little tricks of the trade, and it might not do anything, but give them more confidence that you're thinking about them. I had a coach at a camp I went to who said, anytime you check into a game, squat down with your feet a little wider than shoulder width apart. Put your hands kind of through your legs and like sway back to back 3 or 4 times each way, and it will like loosen you up. So I don't know if it's true, but I always did that. and I always think of him like when I used to check into games, and it might be a placebo, but it definitely helped. So think about how you're getting your players ready to check into the game, which leads me to the next point of like, how are you coaching your bench during games? And like, I know, Joe, you're on your bench the whole game, which I love. But like, are you keeping them engaged? Are you talking to them? Are you addressing them? Are you teaching them how to watch and dissect the game and see coverages that they will see when they check in? So it might be a play that you saw on film before the game, and you turn around and say, you see how they're hedging that? We're looking to throw back and attack it off the couch, whatever it is. Make sure that your bench is part of the huddle, unless they're Patty Millsing it and, getting their dynamic warm-up in. For the teams, and I think the refs will probably tell your guys to stay off the court, but do it anyways. And for the teams that have strength coaches, like, it's great to involve them or just ask them, like, hey, is there a way we can get our guys ready to play when they're on their bench? Some teams have bikes behind the bench, or they have space. You can do some little dynamic warm-up. So I think that's a way you can help your bench players check into the game. And like we say in help defense, when you're on the nail and the ball's on the other wing, your mind is there, is on your guy, even though your body's at the nail. So it's the same thing. Like, your bench should be in the game mentally, even if they're not in the game physically. And I think you can coach players on that. And I think that goes a long ways. And then
Jonah,
yeah.
As someone who, nobody knows when they're going to get in the game with me, but what I will always do is I will go up to them before, like, I know I want to put them in, and I'll say, I'll let them know to start getting ready, so that they can, if they were not engaged completely, they can start to lock their mind in on who they're going to go in for.
And I would say, like, Ben Walsh, I wish was on this call. He was on last week. He has a soccer background, but you see it in soccer all the time. Like, they do their dynamic warm-up a couple minutes before they check in. So
I was going to say, that was my next thing I was going to say, is that I honestly think the day would come when, I don't know how we do it, but just think about it. A cold body going into a game. God bless Ginobili and Patty Mills. Everybody else normally comes out cold. And then instantaneously, you might have to sprint. I mean, we talk about load management all the time. Where's the science behind that? Like, guys should get some kind of warm-up before they go into the game. I just, as much as we can possibly make that happen, I would think,
Right.
That's why you target that dude that just got subbed in with the whatever.
Yeah.
The back door or quick change.
I mean, Tommy, think about what we did with Kenny at Bates, right? Like, he would not even be on the bench for the first X amount of minutes of the game because he had to get loose. And that idea, I try to tell my guys to do that, especially last year's a little bit of an extreme example, but I really only played 7 guys. So the 2 guys, I'd be like, just go get ready. I'll tell you when you're going to go in. You know what I mean? I think that.
No, you're right. It was a good thing I stole that bike. Hey, it was a good thing I stole that bike from Bowden, wasn't it? Right? I'm just kidding.
Like, literally, we had a kid, like, 1, 2, 3, go. All right, kitty, go get your ass on the bike. Like, we'll tell you when you're going in, because he was just needed it, right? So I think that's something that I've carried. And like Jonah said, like, I don't know if it actually helps, but I know the kids are sweating when they go in the game.
Right. I would also
say, Jonah, go ahead.
No, go on. You got it.
I want to ask you, at your level, how much does the upper management and load management play, or how has it changed? Because you've been in this long enough now. So over the course of your career coaching at the professional level, how much has that affected substitutions patterns, and how do you go around dealing with that or working around that? Minus Kawhi Leonard. I'm not trying to go there, but like, seriously, there's more, like, guys can only play so much, and then like a guy may be on a certain kind of like, what's that look like, and how do you navigate that?
I was going to talk about this later, but we'll dive into it right now. I would just say a couple things that, and we talked about this when we had the performance one with Sam Refson and Adi Voss and Missy. Macbeth, I think is her last name. But the science and the performance staffs in the professional and even collegiate ranks are not going to become less. Their influence is just going to become greater. So it is on us to either fight that or learn to work with it. And I would say I can't really comment right now on that question. Ask me in a year and I'll let you know. Like, because I don't know, I think everyone approaches that differently, and hopefully you are in lockstep with the performance director and the strength coach and athletic trainer and front office and coaching staff. You're trying to integrate all three of those. But I would just say hopefully there is a reason for everything. And I don't think anyone's trying to sabotage anyone for the most part. But you see it every year. So, but I can't really comment on that.
I mean, like, think about, to stick with the pro example, and you may not be able to comment on this or whatever, but like, just think about how many more people wanted to see Giannis play more minutes in the playoffs, for example, because it's like, what are we saving him for? Like, he can help the team win. Like how long do you go with that marriage of the minutes thing, or will we find out in a year? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious. Like,
yeah, I would just say that everyone has their reason, and it's to cover their behinds, right? Like, so the athletic trainer is never trying to sabotage the coaching staff, but they're answering to someone as well. So the Bucks, I mean, their performance staff is phenomenal. The people I know there, they're great. So I don't think they're giving the coaching staff bad intel or bad info. But like, we always kind of joke, like, there's a minutes restriction, but if you don't win, there's a winning restriction also. And then
I was getting ready to say,
there's a job, you don't have a job, right? Across the NBA, not speaking to anyone in particular, but yeah, someone else can respond.
Well, no, I mean, that's what I was going to say, is that, like, 4 minutes a game extra could save people's jobs. At the end of the day, I was going to say.
What's the difference between 18 minutes and 22 minutes? And I had this talk with Sam Refson a lot. He said nothing really, but you're increasing, especially if it's like an injury that you're coming back from, you're increasing the likeliness of a reoccurrence of that injury. So that's where minute restrictions come from. And like, we know that injuries happen when you're more fatigued. So I think that is where that basis comes from. If it's a like, I think Dragic in the finals was more a pain tolerance thing, and he tried and he ended up playing, but it's just he couldn't explode off of it, right?
Some of it too, though, like, doesn't it go back to like, what are your long-term goals? Like,
well, and this is
they're trying to make decisions that are balancing, like, one, if I'm a playoff team, I'm probably trying to win a championship this year if I think I'm capable. I also have this multi-million-dollar asset that I'm hoping to have for multiple years, to have multiple chances at winning a championship. And maybe I don't think it's happening this year, so that I'm more strict on my minute restriction, because I want this asset to be healthy for 5 years and maximize it, or whatever.
And you want them to feel like they matter, they care, right?
Or I think my asset will perform best playing 36 minutes, and if I play them 40, they're going to decline in production, and it's actually going to hurt our chances of winning. So, like, part of the challenge of this minutes restrictions and stuff is, like, when it doesn't work, people are like, yeah, that's dumb, play your best players more. But if it does work and you win, nobody really talks about, well, like, that was really smart. They didn't play their – instead, when you win and restrict your best players, they're like, oh, that was really smart. They empowered their bench.
Somewhat like
because they played their bench more. And it's like, well, if they lose that series doing the exact same thing, then you're killing them because.
Yeah. Well, so how do we think that plays out at the college level? Like, should we be thinking more about that? Like, not playing guys as much, like getting more out of them by not playing them as much, or should we not be there yet?
Depends on your guys. Also, like, I'm more in the stable of like play your best players more, man. Especially in the postseason, because by that time they should be in good enough shape. And like if you go to the NCAA tournament, you have media timeouts. So like play your best dudes as many minutes as you can because they give you the best chance to win.
Jaren, what were you going to say?
I don't know.
It was just I was a point going to empowering your bench with Kevin was talking about someone like the Spurs used to do back when their best players were their older players with Duncan and Ginobili. Those players did not play nearly as many minutes and were able to have effectiveness first off during those times later in the season and longer into their careers, somewhat because they were taking that thought process. I also wanted to put forward, though, the question of, like, in terms of thinking of substitution patterns, one of the things that we've seen at our institution is that we've had a lot of injuries with players, and we have been of the mindset of play your best players. Like, how much is that going to help you if you're looking at, let's get these guys out earlier in the college level length season, because it's not as much of a grind in the NBA, but losing a player for 6-7 games can change a season at the college level.
Definitely.
Hey, Jonah, do you know in an average 82-game NBA season, how many practices do you average a year?
We have about 60 to 65 practices, but like 7 to 10 of those are before we even play a preseason game. And then probably another 5 to 10 are in preseason. So once we start the 82 games, you're looking at like, let's say 40 to 50. And then we'll have anywhere from 20 to maybe 40 shoot arounds. It just kind of depends on back to back. Some teams over the last 4 years have each year had less and less shoot arounds. So
I think when you factor in practices, I think the college game might be a little bit closer to the NBA game than what we think. If you're 82 games and then 50 practices, right, that's roughly 130.
Yep.
Well, if we're 30 games and about 75 to 80 practices, we're 110.
Right.
So I think the kids get grinded down in practice, I think, just as much. Question I had for the group, and it's probably doesn't apply to Jonah as much, but if we're talking about scripting minutes and kind of putting minutes on a grid, well, what do you guys think and what do your bosses think about the on-court behavior and habits and performance? For example, a turnover, he's coming out, or we're going to let him live with one. If he turns it over twice, he's coming out. He's lazy. We know he doesn't want to sprint back on defense. He does it one time, he's coming out. Shot selection. Does behavior just throw your predetermined minutes out the window? Is that going to be an outdated way of thinking now because we need to coddle these players so much? That's why I don't think this applies to Jonah as much. But the college kids, these 18, 19, and 20 years old, they don't know how to play. They don't know what it takes to win a college game. Whether it's D3 or D2 or D1, as you guys have said, it's the same thing. They don't know what it takes to win a college game, how much they have to sacrifice and how unselfish they have to be. Can we talk about that? Or is there any things that you got, like non-negotiables, anything along those lines?
I think Joe, you hit it on the head. I think that it's when it comes down to your non-negotiable list, but I think you also have to probably try to balance it all out with the vision for the whole season. You know what I mean? Like building it towards that whole season. But this is one thing I have consciously tried to do with subs. I really try not to sub someone out off of error because, they're coming off pissed and then you can't coach them up, whatever, but 4 turnovers in a row, we got to come out, we got to have a conversation. But I think that's a feel thing. And it might be a couple guys on your team who you give a little bit more leeway to, or certain categories. Maybe you've been talking to a kid about, these are the kind of shots we want you to shoot, this, that, or the other thing. And a different kid has a different thing. So the kid who you're not talking about shot selection took a bad shot, but you don't take him out for that. And I think at the end of the day, how all of that is solved, and this is an area where I think we're not great at coaching-wise, is communication. You know what I mean? Like truly, not just us speaking, but the player understanding what we said And I forget where I saw this or heard this, but once I heard it, I started doing it. Is like after you have a conversation about these kind of things or whatever, let's put in air quotes the stuff the players don't want to hear. Like we say what we say, and then like you say back to them, okay, what did I say? Do you get what I say? And like you make them say it back to you, and or even email it, write it back to you, so that you know that they comprehended exactly what you said. Because sometimes the stuff gets lost in communication. Well, coach, I didn't know that I shouldn't have shot that shot. You said not shoot this shot. Like a small thing becomes such a huge thing.
So, Joe, I did have a question for you as well. You talked about some of your non-negotiables and that being reasons for substitution. Are some of those things occurring in practices as well? And are they things that you can actually address in practices that you may not need to make those substitutions in games, and you can use that to follow maybe a more scripted plan?
Yeah, definitely the same thing. But you guys know when the lights come on and the girlfriend walks into the gym, you know, it triggers something different in these guys in a game, you know. So, and for us, me and my staff have always talked about, okay, what are we willing to live with? Bad shots or turnovers? Do we want guys shooting with freedom, shooting with confidence? We're not going to pull them for bad shots, but we do have a tight handle on being strong with the ball. Or conversely, let's not put up with any bullcrap shots, but if a kid makes an honest turnover, he's trying to make the right play, let's live with him. And maybe this is why we were so bad last year on offense. But I'd like to hear what Coach Underwood does, because I could see him breaking his pregame minutes grid real quick in one of those hot Big Ten games there, Zach.
Yeah, he doesn't take too kindly to defensive mistakes. I think that his big thing, he loves to give freedom offensively and to be the trend of a guy taking a bunch of bad shots. But defensive lapses, some of our non-negotiables, like helping out of strong side corner and, you know, just having a major lapse in defensive transition is always gonna get you to the bench. And then, you know, I think that just some of the things that are our culture things, like offensive rebounding responsibilities, if you're not going to the glass, that'll get you out. And it's just things that we emphasize every day in practice, most heavily. And honestly, it's, you know, a lot of effort-based things is the basis of it. But well, we try to have a plan. And we had a kid last year who was with us who was a super talented kid and came in, great energy player. But if you played him for more than, you know, 3-4 minutes consecutively, you know that, okay, you're going to give up 5 points in defensive transition and he's give up a 3 helping out of the strong side corner. So it was a handful managing his high level of production and ability and energy that he, you know, brought to the table, while also, okay, we know that he's doing all these great things. We know if we keep him in, you know, disastrous things are going to happen. Yeah. And, you know, obviously I use that term jokingly, but so there were a lot of times where it's like, well, why are you taking me out? I didn't do anything wrong. Well, yes, but you are about to. And so if you want to get into this, come with me for a couple minutes and we'll get you back in there and continue to, you know, be impactful for us. Actually, the kid ended up, you know, not being happy with his role and transferring at the end of the season. So I don't know if that was handled correctly or incorrectly, but he helped us win a lot of games because of his effectiveness in that role, and helped us lose a lot of games when we tried to overextend him a little bit. So it's just a tricky balance, obviously. And, you know, I think at our level more so than some other places, the transfer thing is a very real thing with minutes and roles and things of that nature. So, you know, you take that into account a little bit as well.
And theoretically, doesn't this maybe allude to one of the previous questions about bench engagement and being ready? You know, if a kid knows that the guy in front of him, if he's not sprinting back on D or calling out those screens or punching it into the post, because I might check in at 18 and not 13 or 12 or 11. And so I guess my question is, should we coach and sub based on feel and by performance and habits and expectations versus maybe just a preset script, which again, I completely understand it in the NBA, but maybe with us, not as much, but that's why we're talking about it.
I would just echo what I said earlier, that like, and Tommy disagrees. Like he said, he just kind of does it based on feel the whole time. But if you have your plan, then you can adjust from it. But if you don't have your plan, I don't like going based off of feel. Like I like to have my thoughts organized going into the game, and then the adjustments I make are from that, and I have reasons because of that. And for me, that helps me evaluate what I did in a game better. Which that, you know, other people can disagree with that. That's fine, but that's my belief with pretty much everything that I do.
I would say.
Hey, how about go ahead, Hoppy? Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say a lot of it too comes down to like, what do you communicate to your team? You could think what Tommy thinks and say like, okay, I'm gonna sub based off how I feel, and if guys know that, then they're prepared for it. You could also say, take Jonah's point of view and say like, at 16 minutes you're going in, and guys know that. And you could also take Joe's point of view and say like, here's our non-negotiables that we sub for. If you screw this up, I'm taking you out and you're going in. And guys know like, okay, when Tommy screws up, Joe's going in. So Joe knows like on the bench, if Tommy screws up, I'm going into the game. In Jonah's scenario, like Joe knows, okay, at 16 minutes I'm going in. And in Tommy's scenario, he knows like, I better be ready because I might go in. But a lot of it is less about, I think what I'm gathering from this discussion so far at least, is it's less about what method you're choosing for your substitutions, because a lot of it depends on your team, right? Like if you have a young team, you may give them a little bit more leeway because you're worried about their confidence and them developing to be a good player in 2 years. If you have a senior-laden team that's super talented and should win the league, you might yank dudes quickly if they miss a single rotation because you're talented enough to handle this. So like a lot of it comes back to like communicating that to your team, I guess it would be my big takeaway of like how I'm going to sub and what the method is. And so that they're clear on what are the circumstances that are going to lead to me going in. That could be coach's decision. That could be my practice habits. That could be the guy in front of me makes a mistake, and it could be time-based. But if the player knows that, then they're in a better spot. I think the book was, at least the book I've read, Tommy, that you were talking about was Rod Olson talks about those meeting habits of having people repeat back to you what the one big takeaway was.
Yeah. I'll add to what you said about subs too. I was wondering, like, I think we saw this play out, to be quite honest with you, in the NBA playoffs, is also the accountability for when we have non-negotiables or things that we would sub maybe a bench player out for. How do we go about subbing our starters or our star players out for those same? Let's just be honest. Like, we're going to give them some leeway, but how much leeway in that area is too much leeway? And when does that start to cause cracks in everything, aka the Clippers, for lack of a better word, you know? And how do we manage that?
But again, like, have you had that discussion with your players of, you know what, Jonah, you're a role player. You need to have every defensive rotation done perfectly, or I'm taking you out. And guess what? Tommy's not a role player. He's our best scorer. So Tommy can miss 1 or 2 rotations, and I'm still going to play him because it's net positive for us.
At the end of the day,
can you have that conversation with the dude and tell him, like, you're not good enough offensively to make mistakes defensively?
Yeah.
In a couple places you can, but not many. Like, being honest, I think, you know, because it's not bad. Like, college is a little bit different because as the head coach, you're also in essence the general manager. You're the one, like, you know, but like it gets tricky, I think, you know.
And I'm also,
I cut somebody off. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I was gonna say, I also don't know that a lot of the college players that I've interacted with don't have the maturity to handle that conversation that you're suggesting, Kevin. that you tell them that they don't have the offensive skills to do that. Like, there's still the illusion that they're better than they are.
Yeah. So I guess my pushback would be there's like the words you're saying, the message you're delivering, and like how you deliver it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you find a way that the kid receives it? And do you continue, like, are you consistent in your messaging of like, this is non-negotiable? If you don't rotate, I'm not playing you. And are you consistent in that? And then over 4 years, and again, like, I'm not at the scholarship level, I'm at a Division III level, and like kids have left our program, whatever. So maybe it's not the right way, but I do think the more consistency there is in the messaging, and it's like, for me, you can sub based off of things you've coached. If you haven't coached it, you can't sub off of it. Like if I don't talk about turnovers in practice, I can't get into the game and say, you know what, Jaren, you turned the ball over, I'm taking you out because you turned it over. Like that was a dumb thing to do. Everyone knows that. Like I haven't coached it before. At halftime, like sometimes with my assistants, I'll have arguments. They'll just like give me stats. Oh, they have 12 offensive rebounds. Like, okay, great. Like, how do we coach it and fix it and address it and have a conversation with someone? And the more conversation, I think, like, so for me, it's just like the more conversations you have and the more direct you are and deliver it in a way that's received, the better off you're going to be with substitution, no matter what the method to your madness is.
And,
like,
and it's got to be
bosses
repeated
talk
too.
About, sorry, not to ramble, but like any message, there's a sender and a receiver. And who's the most important person? It's not the person sending the message, it's the receiver. Like you can deliver the God's honest truth. And if you deliver it in a bad way, like I'm going to shut down and not listen to you. You could tell me a half truth and you deliver it well, like I'm more likely to listen. So like a lot of it too is, I think, on us as coaches. Like it's easy, it's an easy out to say kids these days, they can't do it, whatever. Or is the question, there's a better way to coach it and I haven't found it yet and I'll figure it out by continuing to be honest in my communication and explain like, okay, I took you out, here's why. You've already heard before that if this happens, I'm taking you out. So it's not surprising. I'm just.
This is what I would say. And we've all said this, but like basketball is not an equal opportunity game. Right, so it's easy in the NBA. You're making $35 million, and you're on a two-way contract. Like what the max player can get away with is different, and that's just is what it is. And like we have had that talk with our teams the last few years, and I wouldn't say. I mean, I joke with Ryan Kershaw all the time, who will hopefully join us later, and if not, he'll be back next week. But like. And I think a lot of your teams, your emotional maturity and intellectual levels as a team might be higher than ours. Literally, like you're maybe not this specific year, maybe, I don't know, but just over the course, like most NBA teams, I think your players are older oftentimes, and they have not been given as much in life recently. So I say that a little facetiously, but maybe not completely. But it comes back to like, Joe, you were saying, you know, if it's a turnover or a bad shot, do you take him out? Like to me, and you were getting at this, Hop, it comes down to your role. And your role is different. And you are constantly coaching your role, like every player's role in your program. So this is what, you know, Dave Severance talked about this with Doc. And Luke does a great job with this. Like day one, he's going down the line telling you what your role is. And to us as a staff, I think once we have communicated that, the part that is missing of that, you know, that link that does not get closed is A, reinforcing it, but more importantly, B, valuing every role the same. Tommy and I were talking about this the other night, like how you two-way player close out and box out so this guy doesn't get an offensive rebound. We value that and we need that as much as star player scoring 30 points.
Yep.
And I think that is where the communication needs to be consistent across the board. And you have to coach your star players. If you don't, you're going to lose them. and you need to be hard on them and demanding, and the great ones want that. But I think when you only coach them, or you only coach your 7th man or 9th man, and they're not getting the love, like it can be different. It's like, I mean, I don't have kids, but everyone says it's like raising your kids. Like maybe you love different ones, different amounts, but you shouldn't, right? And you might talk to them differently, and you might give them different types of leeway with different limits. But the love and the teachings that you're trying to give them is the same. It just comes across differently.
I think also to dig in. No comment. I'm living through a pandemic. I'm trying to work. I don't even know what the hell's going on anymore, parenting-wise. I'm just trying to survive, Hoppy. I'll say this, though, about the conversations. It's in the critical, difficult conversations that we have to be brutally honest, you know? And like, so for us at college, like, I think it starts in the recruiting process, like letting them know who we are, how we want to be. Like, that's where we're like, we can't sugarcoat. I always would tell people, like, listen, you might want to come to practice before you say you want to come play, you know, like, or like when I was coaching AAU, oh, coach, we want to play, coach. No, hold up. You might want to come and see, because like, this isn't for everybody. I'm not for everybody.
Hey, listen, 50 suicides to start practice is not for everybody.
It's not for everybody.
Hey, listen, fatigue. You know, the number one rule I have is fatigue will never be a factor. I don't need load management. My dudes are in shape.
Never was.
You know, but like
science.
That you know, that's we shy away from, like, you know what, like, there are a lot of good coaches. There are a lot of great coaches, but there are not a lot of great leaders. And to me, like, if we start to peel that back, and what do? Leaders plan. So think about this. We're talking about the substitution plan. It all factors into our yearly plan, how we expect our team to progress, how we're trying to build our team out, what we're trying to get from our team in, you know, January and February. Like, it's all encompassed into one. And I think that at the end of the day, like Hoppy and how we've all said, there's different ways to do that, but you got to reverse engineer it, and then you got to believe in it, and you got to stick to it, and you got to plan to make your plan work, you know. And maybe at our levels, we have some more things that we have to deal with to execute that, or less, depending on, you know, if you want to say the NBA has more stuff to deal with or whatever. But at the end of the day, that I think is critical. I just don't feel like that conversation is had enough, especially like, this is the kid's paycheck. You know what I mean? Their playing time is their paycheck, you know, and like for us, we want to get good investment on our money. Like, I give you 5 minutes. I want to get like 8-9 minutes worth of my investment, not just that 5 minutes. You know what I mean?
I think too, like, part of it goes back to like reinforcing with film too, of like, what are you highlighting and valuing for different guys? Like, for your best player, you may not highlight the simple play as often as the roll guy that you just put in and made a simple extra pass when the guy X'd out to him. So he threw it to the corner. Like, your role guy, you may show that on film and be like, this is a great play, and praise it, because for his role, that's like what's valuable. Even for me with my team, like, we started talking about our bench and like being a positive vocal teammate, and we would have great plays on film, and the only thing I would ask them was about the bench. What's our bench doing on this play? What's our PVT? Like, there's 10 guys sitting on the bench. We were 5 out of 10 on this play. This was a great play. This was a winning play. This is something we value, and only 5 guys celebrated it. Or all 10 guys did it. This is phenomenal. We made a great play on the court, and our bench was into it. And like, again, like, the more you can communicate that stuff, like, I was in the D League for a year before it became the G League. But one thing that I thought Casey Hill, the guy that I was working for, did a really good job of was communicating things to guys. And one of the really interesting factors in that league is when guys come down on assignment.
It's not down. It's not down.
At the time it was.
It still is, but I'm saying it shouldn't be.
Oh, when they were on assignment.
There you go. There you
I'm
go.
saying the G League level of the NBA level. When they were on assignment, they
In
would
Fort
have-
Wayne. Fort Wayne is north of Indiana, so we would say come up.
Yeah, come
Play with
on.
the big boys.
We're all on a big come up right now. Whatever. When a new player would show up and it'd be like, okay, this guy's playing X number of minutes tonight. Our head coach then had to go to our team and have a conversation, and he was very good about like doing it. From my recollection, he would usually do it at like shoot around or sometime before the game, individually with the player that was being impacted. He would not do it in front of the team. He'd be like, "Hey, Jonah, like, I know you've been killing it for us the last 10 games, and we're on a whatever game win streak, but Tommy's on assignment tonight, and he's got to play 30 minutes, so you're only going to play 10 minutes." And, like, day of a game, that's a pretty shitty conversation.
Right.
So, bad conversation to try to have with someone, but, like, the fact that he had the tough conversation and did it face-to-face and did it one-on-one, I think went a long way with our players. Didn't mean that they liked it or wanted to do it anymore, but like if you can have conversations like that with your guys of like, hey, listen, like here is why you're not playing. I know you don't want to hear it, but this is the truth. And whatever the reason is the reason. There's a guy on assignment. There's a guy called up. There's a guy called down. Like there's an injury. This guy's not doing his job. Again, I think it goes back to like the communication piece of, as the head coach, how are you communicating whatever your method is to your players? And doesn't mean they're always going to like it, but the more you communicate, the better spot you're going to be in.
It's the separator, Hoppy, as far as I'm concerned, the communication piece, you know?
Tommy's talking about good leaders, so I'm going to try to be a good leader now and tie it up for the night. We're about an hour 45 in, which is about under 2 hours, so that's a win in our book. And hopefully I don't get subbed out too soon. But obviously, thank you guys all for coming tonight. Thanks to those that can't be here tonight that are going to watch this and continue to support us. And I know that the format was different, kind of digging into this one aspect, but I think it's a really good approach, even if we don't do it all the time. And hopefully you all will benefit from tonight and can incorporate some of the ideas we talked about, and hopefully it helps your program down the road. I'll send out the link tonight. I'll send out those few forms that I shared, and I'll send out the contact list as well. So unless anyone else has questions or just last minute thoughts, that's all I got.